Western civilization is in trouble. Russia is nowhere near as strong as a lot of people would have assumed before. Parliament and the city are not places of hope.
But our country's foundation, they are changing. Very warm welcome, Major General Tim Cross, retired British Army, a guest with us again. I'm delighted you returned back after last time. No, it's a real pleasure to have you back here. So very warm welcome to you. I'm really interested in getting your perspective on the latest in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine did this audacious act, it's almost 4 weeks ago yesterday, to invade Russia. What a great plan. Only last done in 1941.
Yeah.
And you sort of go, hang on a minute, for all sorts of reasons, from a military perspective, it doesn't seem particularly smart. And yet there are clearly two sides to it. What's your take on why do they do it? What are they seeking to achieve? How's it going? Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, the question is it a masterstroke or is it a reckless gamble and doomed to failure? There's been a lot of talk, conversation, things written about this, and took everybody by surprise. And I think that's probably the first thing we should say, that whatever the consequences, the ability to actually make this happen without people realizing makes you think back to some of the wars in the past where everything was a surprise, like Iraq invading Kuwait or like Japan and Pearl Harbor or whatever. I don't want to overplay it, but to be able to bring together that combat power and do something with it without anybody realizing was pretty clever.
But I absolutely agree with you. But do you think the West did know? Because these things are always intelligence-led.
Yeah.
But we're both probably veterans of enough operations to know at times it's better to seek forgiveness than ask permission.
Yeah.
Do you think the West did know about this?
I don't. The truth is, of course, I don't know. But my sense is we're not talking about a million blokes on one side of a border or another. We're talking about 10,000.
Well, probably only 1,000 the initial.
I was going to say initially less than that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we, the UK, the US, hadn't really picked up what was going on. We may have been aware of some things that were happening, but not realizing what this was about and not realizing what the intent was. So going back to your original question, part of me now thinks basically they have carved out a salient. So from a military perspective, and particularly from a land warfare perspective, and the history of warfare, the first thing that comes to my mind is, why aren't Russia doing something about cutting that salient? Because if they were able to cut these guys off, then the combat power that Ukraine would lose as a result of this would be pretty significant. And in order to generate that combat power, there's no doubt they've had to take it away from elsewhere on the line. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, people are talking about 3 or 4 reasons why this happened. One of those reasons, I'm sure, is that the Ukraine and Zelensky hoped that it would pull Russian troops away from Donbass in order to have to do something about this, because the psychology, as you say, the first time Russian territory has been taken on since 1941. And the fact that they haven't done that is interesting. But I think that's what he rather hoped would happen. I have to say, just as an aside really, to move the sort of combat power we're talking about to deal with this salient without being detected, the logistics of it and the pulling it all together, and it's then vulnerable as you try and move that sort of scale of numbers of kit and people and so forth, may be one of the reasons that the Russians in the end decided, look, we're not going to be drawn away from this. And it's enabled them to put more pressure in the Donbass, and they are succeeding, the Donbass. There's no doubt about that. So they themselves are pushing salient, deeper and widening that salient even as we speak. But nonetheless, trying to do something, to at least win the psychology of war, maybe pull some military combat power away. Secondly, I think there's a message Zelensky wants to send to the West. We can conduct offensive operations now. And one of the issues I think we've discussed in the past is that although we've been doing a lot of training at the tactical level with the Ukrainian soldiers and enabling them to fight a better fight on the battlefield at a tactical level, the operational level, the ability to conduct serious counteroffensive operations, which is much more complicated, I think what they wanted to send a message was, we're capable of doing this. What we now need from you in the West is the kit, equipment, the support to enable us to expand this. And that sent an important message to the West. Stick with us. We're not going to be defeated here. And of course, it sends a very powerful message to Russia, the Russian people, to Putin, and all those other things that we could explore. Has it been? I've been away surprised that they're still there, because a lot of people are saying they're going to do this and then pull back relatively quickly. like all good military planners, people will be saying, well, of the 3 plans we put in place, it's always the 4th that happens. We've got to eventually avoid drive this. It may be that they're feeling much more comfortable at this stage with holding the ground they've got. There's no indication that they're really increasing the size and shape of it. So how much longer they'll stay there before they pull back, who knows? On balance, I think it was a very positive move, very well executed. But for going back where I started, my worry if I was Ukrainian was if we don't get out of here soon, we could find ourselves being cut off, and that organisation will wither on the vine.
I wonder whether, as you say, there's a lot of discussion that this was to try and divert the troops away from the front line. But there's also been some interesting conversations that say, if you marry that incursion up, embarrassing Putin with the long-range strikes that they've been doing as well, the consistent line between those is sending the message to normal Russians that they are at war.
Yep.
And that although Putin controls the information narrative, if buildings are exploding, if oil refineries are on fire, you can't easily hide that. And in that enclave, there's reports 120,000, potentially significantly more, Russians have had to be evacuated.
Yeah.
All of those are going to talk. Do you think there was much, from a grand strategic perspective, that was aimed to try to erode national support for Putin within Russia, or do you think that's fanciful?
Well, I wouldn't say it's fanciful, but my honest view is it's not going to make that much of a difference. I think the hope and aspiration that we would be sending a message through the Russian people and all the things you've just described is part of it. But I've never been one to believe that the Russian people are about to throw Putin out and all that sort of stuff. It could happen over time if things deteriorate. I think linked to this is the ability of Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia and bring more combat power to bear deeper. So the whole Storm Shadow, ATACMS debates and so forth, which I personally believe we should be allowing Ukraine to do and take that fight into the deep battle. And that would then reinforce the messages you've just been talking about. And maybe then people would begin to stir up more trouble for Putin. And how Putin would respond to that is another issue. But overall, anything can happen, of course. But overall, I think the majority of Russians still support Putin's engagement here, on balance.
Yeah, and it does appear likely that actually we live in a democracy, so we tend to put a lot of focus on the people. But actually, Putin's probably held in power not by the people, but by the oligarchs and those, and they can't go on holiday in Paris anymore. Kids can't go to school, in privately educated in the UK. They can't travel to America. They can't enjoy their yachts the same way. And I suspect there is a view that eventually there may be a view amongst them that actually the war is taking a turn that we hadn't foreseen at all, and maybe that's the trigger. Can I go back to the point about the weapons? You sort of characterised that by going in, Zelensky's shown that give me the weapons, I can go on. First of all, having gone as far as he has, it would seem folly to go any further, because the more he goes in, that's dangerous. And the second one is, there aren't the weapons. We don't have unlimited supplies of weapons. To my knowledge, Zelensky's used up quite a lot of the Storm Shadows. We only had so many available. And therefore, the real issue is, how do you create a long-term sustainable model for weapons? Zelensky can wave his hands all he likes. And I'm not talking about these shells, because I think, there are moves afoot to replenish the shells, aren't there now? The dumb weapons. But as soon as you get onto these long-range stuff, there's got to be a different answer. It's not the West provides them anymore.
Well, ultimately, they will have to, and they are producing some of their own weapon systems themselves, of course. Ukraine is developing a defense industry, which it didn't have before, and doing things, interestingly, far quicker than we have traditionally done, if you like. Some of the capability of producing artillery ammunition, artillery pieces, and other systems have been moved. BAE Systems are talking about setting up industrial capacity in Ukraine itself. But compared to what Russia is capable of producing, there's no doubt at all that we're on the back foot here. And some of the contracts that we, the UK, and others are letting are taking months to arrive and will produce relatively small amounts of armaments over the next 12 to 18 months. So the question is, can Zelensky survive long enough if Western industry was to ramp up its production and be able to give him serious amounts of equipment? But in the short term, he's definitely short of stuff. And there's no doubt about that at all. And Germany, amongst others, are, to be honest, I don't know quite what's happening in Germany with the latest election results and all the rest of it. The current government is under pressure, but a lot of people in Germany are not in favour of continuing to support Ukraine the way they have. And so some of the promises that Germany made don't seem to be coming to fruition. Some of the promises that we, generally speaking, in the West promised are taking much longer to arrive. So has Ukraine got the ability to conduct a serious counteroffensive, as in 1941-42, those sweeping moves across? I don't think they have. And therefore, this was, for that reason, apart from anything else, it was going to be a limited incursion that would have to seize territory, hold some ground, and then decide.
But it's just the angle I haven't heard much talked about is this weapons angle. Because if you take it to its limit and say the West has largely emptied its cupboard of weapons, the cupboards are empty. So you can wail your hands all you like. The only way is for you to build your own. And it does, as you say, look as if President Zelensky's found a really effective way of getting weapons much faster and quicker.
Yeah.
But even that, if reports are to be believed, Russia's about to take delivery of a whole load of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles from Iran and some from North Korea. That will be used for the short-range targeting and keep Russians' self-generated defense industrial base missiles for longer range. All of that feels like it's an order of magnitude more capability than Ukraine can do. And we've been talking for 2.5 years about the West spinning up. I haven't seen any evidence that that's actually happening. And when you put the money in one end, it takes 2 years.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think one of the problems has been that West there's a lot of rhetoric from the West that hasn't actually produced the sort of resources that we're talking about here. Now, the rhetoric's not unimportant, but I think we've been slow to respond, giving the Ukrainians the capabilities they've needed. It's taken weeks, if not months, of shall we do it, shall we not do it? The F-16 is a good example of that. The armoured, our main battle tanks and so forth, that was very slow in delivering. There is still resource capability in the West that if we were really serious, we would be prepared to give them. But from a UK point of view, it's pretty limited. Other countries are helping out, Sweden and Poland, and others are I think, making a difference. But collectively as a whole, I agree with you. We are not giving them sufficient resources to really conduct serious counteroffensive operations.
And if you follow that through to its logical conclusion, you mentioned that Putin seems to be on the front foot at the moment. Prevailing view is he's trying to take the remainders of the Donbass. That seemed to be what the special military operation was all about. When he achieves that, what's he going to do next?
Well, and part of the other issue that we didn't touch on earlier is that Zelensky and a lot of people have said that by grabbing some Russian territory, it puts him in a stronger negotiating position. Now, I don't, as far as I'm aware, Russia has not said that its overall intent is still not to seize the whole of Ukraine. So in theory, anyway, that's what they're trying to achieve. But I think there's a general feeling that if they secure the rest of the Donbass, and they're making good progress, as we alluded to earlier, that maybe Putin is then prepared to go to some sort of negotiating table. And I think Zelensky, for all of his understandable rhetoric again, and holding firm, we're not going to give in, etc., I think he's not stupid. He recognizes that where they are, they need to get to a negotiating table. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If we carry on the way we are, Ukraine, I think, is going to get in more and more difficult situation, and Russia will overwhelm what's going on.
I guess that's what leads me to, my sort of point is that if behind closed doors, the West has recognized that winning for Ukraine is probably not, i.e. sweeping Russia out of all occupied Ukraine is probably not the answer. Yeah. If Russia will grind to a halt eventually, and that some sort of negotiation will have to happen, then why would the West invest loads of money in defense industries to spin them up when they'll just be getting into optimum production at the time when
we pull plugs?
With full plugs.
And I do think, again, one's got to be careful about vast generalizations here, but I do think a lot of people in the West genuinely believe that this is going to have to end in a negotiated settlement, and the sooner the better. And therefore, to put pressure diplomatically in other ways on Zelensky to go to the negotiating table. Now, to be fair, he has said that he's prepared to have the next series of negotiations, and he wants the Russians to be represented there. So I think collectively there's a feeling that this this is going that way. And yes, in terms of to ramp up defense industry to that scale that would be required to conduct what we're talking about, a lot of people were saying, well, do we really need to do that? Now, from a UK point of view, being parochial about it, maybe that's one of the reasons, the Labour government is having a strategic defence review. It's looking at this 2.5% GDP, the economic situation being what it is. I think they're pretty hopeful that somehow they can draw a line on this. My own view is that Ukraine will not be able to put Russia out of the territory that they've occupied. I can't see Russia ever giving up Crimea. So what that negotiated settlement would look like is, quite difficult. And can you then trust Putin beyond that? I would be very worried about that. And I can understand why Zelensky.
But it's also philosophically, if you negotiate a solution, a peace, it's likely to reward Putin for his aggression.
Yeah.
How does that sit comfortably with global security, with President Xi looking at Taiwan, with North Korea looking at South Korea? I don't quite know where that leads us.
Well, it takes us into a broader strategic context, which is how does the West see itself today, 30 years in, to wars of choice, responsibility to protect, getting prepared to engage, standing firm for democracy, not allowing brutal dictatorships to slaughter their people, all these other things that we got involved in Kosovo and Bosnia and Iraq and so on and so forth. And I think collectively the West is now in a position where it would breathe a sigh of relief. It wouldn't like it. It doesn't approve of it, but it's not prepared to put the necessary resources into enabling Ukraine to win this. They would, I think most of Europe would be quite, well, and I don't want to overplay it, but happy enough to say, okay, draw a line, settle it where it stands. Whether it would be an equivalent of the Korean settlement, where there's a line in the sand, but there's no actual peace agreement, or what it would look like, I don't know. But my sense is that that's an overriding view.
But that's a short-term appealing for the politicians. Long-term,
sure.
Our global reliance on minerals, on resource in Africa, some of the Russians are moving in already and doing all sorts of deals and military presence. It just, I don't know what the answer is, but it feels like a more dangerous world, and it feels like we can't just afford to put up our borders.
No, I would agree with that. And the message that it's sending to the other important players, Brazil, India, UAE, other nations that have stood to one side on some of this stuff, and are certainly not, certainly not on our side in this context, and in some cases haven't voted in the UN and all this. I think they're watching this with some interest, but I think it's part of this broader piece, which is that the West is losing its influence, and I don't think we have a current generation of politicians who want to do, in any sense, what we've been doing over the last 30 years.
So. Are you saying that Zelensky basically dealt himself a couple of aces for the final negotiation? And if so, will Putin view that territorial gain as a strong card if there was a final negotiation or not?
I think, again, I've got to be careful because the honest answer is, of course, I don't know. But my sense is that Zelensky has, in achieving what he's achieved, managed to put a couple of aces on the table. And the question is, does he hang on to that? Is he going to have to withdraw from it? What else could happen? If he finds himself being outflanked and cut off and so forth, that whole psychological piece could change overnight. But I think he's trying to put himself in a stronger position for those negotiations that are bound to come, in the not too distant future. And I think that Putin, you can reverse the argument by Putin saying, we're not going to play this game. We'll just wait. They'll wither on the vine in the end. We'll keep this going for another 2, 3, 4 years if necessary, but we will continue to push on this. Because we can see the West is not giving them the sort, all that we've been discussing. Now, I'm not convinced that Putin wants this thing to drag on for that length of time. So if he can end up in a situation where he's secured the Donbass, secured Crimea, and regains the territory in the Kursk that he's lost, maybe he'd be prepared to draw an eye on it as well.
And he takes a win back home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about, I guess, the lesser of all evils in settling, and the other countries in the world that might have good relationships with Putin, and some of that stuff is developed. The BRICS organization, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others now joining. there appears to have been some big moves recently, which may be strengthening Putin's arm, not in a war sense, but in a global power and dominance point of view. So I think the entry into this, to get into it, might be that quite recently China cancelled a large order, a crop order with the US for 250 million tons. Also a huge one to Australia, maybe even as high as 1 million, not the largest thing ever. Now, America sits at the center of all these trades from a commodities point of view, but also a dollar point of view. So the question is, where is China going to get this stuff that they've cancelled the order for? And it's not coming from America, it's not coming from Australia, but it's going to come from one of the other countries. And the worry is that the US won't see these trades and it won't be traded in dollars. So there's another thing going on which got nothing to do with war or territory gain in Ukraine, but it's got a lot to do with world economics and gaining a share with these new relationships which are growing. So, you know, in a way, I'm not saying this is a consequence, but it's another move that Putin and his fellows are making, ostensibly against the West.
There's several issues there, I think. One is, first of all, I'd say let's not overplay Russia and its ability to really sway some of this stuff. I mean, what's come out of these last few years is that Russia is nowhere near as strong as a lot of people would have assumed beforehand. And I think their influence is not so much that people like Russia, is that they don't like the West in what we're doing, and that therefore, it's not that Russia's going to emerge again as some sort of superpower in the way that it was. And I think that, your conversation takes us back to the end of the Cold War, and I can't remember whether we discussed this before, but you remember Fukuyama writes this book, The End of History, everybody's going to be free and capitalist and liberal democracy and so on. And he's a student of Huntington, and Huntington says, hang on, that's not the way things are really. What we're going to see is the rise of other civilizations to balance the Western civilization, and those other civilizations will begin to challenge some of those organizations that we put in place in the late part of the war, 1944-45, and post-war, organizations like the UN, like the World Bank, and like the global economic systems that we're talking about here, the way that the whole distribution of cash around the world works and all the rest of it. A lot of these people would begin to push back on that. Right. And that's coming really as a result of the rise of China rather than, I think, Russia. But I do think it's going to have an impact. And the dollar economy, everything is traded in dollars and so forth. That is beginning to be challenged by China, and others are looking at that and thinking, actually, we'd quite like a bit of that, whether it's from Brazil or India or the other countries we've talked about. So my sense is that Fukuyama was wrong. I mean, in the great arc of history, as the President, what's his name, said recently, the arc of history is in our favor. That may be so, but it's a pretty long arc. I think Huntington is far more right in terms of where we stand today. And I genuinely worry about where Western civilization is for some of the reasons we've touched on. And the rise of these other civilizations is beginning to make its strength felt. And it is challenging these institutions. It's challenging the way that world trade goes on. And therefore, as you say, buying from other markets and actually not even having sight of some of these trades now that's going on. So all the data and intelligence that we were chatting about previously, the Americans and us and the West are not having sight of this anymore.
Yeah, that would be terrible. So these things might feel actually much bigger than the military strength.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Military. Yeah. I mean, the military has always been, why do we have the military in the context of this is to try to secure an environment in which the politics and the economics sort themselves out, whether that's in the Balkans or, Northern Ireland or wherever else I've been involved with over the years. The military doesn't solve these problems in and of itself, and it doesn't, it has to be that broader piece that is the important.
But I think what's interesting about this whole conversation, we're not going to be able to flush it out today because it's a much bigger topic. But it goes back to what the Defence Review, we were talking outside. It goes to why do we have military? What are we defending? Is it our way of life? Is it our belief system? Is it our influence around the world? And I think we've had this sort of decades of a US-led way of thinking, capitalist way of thinking with certain assumptions around international criminal courts and United Nations or whatever. But that isn't universally a global view of
no, it's not.
The world. And And actually, there's a hint of arrogance if we think that's right just because we believe in it. Yeah. And whether the pendulum will swing fully across, that the very fact you have NATO means you have to have an axis of evil to counter it, whether you have an alter ego to all these organizations, and whether that actually creates a lot of conflict that's actually of our own making.
Yeah.
Those are the sort of questions that really a defense review should be looking at, rather than how do we bolster our military. You've got to work out what it's actually there for.
Yeah, indeed. And to be fair, maybe George Robertson and the team will start with that sort of analysis. But unfortunately, it will inevitably degenerate into a how much resources have we got, where do we spend the money? I do think that Western civilization is in trouble. And I was speaking recently about the Strategic Defence Review, and I found myself thinking exactly that. What are we defending here? What does the West look like? What are these values that we are so, confident about and genuinely believe, like Fukuyama, that everybody in the world should live in a free democracy? There should be freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of thought. Progress and progressive, this great word progressive, will sweep through the world, and it will all, that's what's going to happen. The evidence is that's not the case. And many countries, in fact, the majority of people in the world now don't live under what you and I, believe is the right way to live. They live under some pretty brutal dictatorships. What's going on in places like China and Iran and all these other countries. And that balance, I think, is shifting against us. And it's partly because I think in any civilization, people become very complacent, very arrogant about how they see the world.
Fall of the Roman Empire.
The fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Greek Empire. I mean, I was in Babylon when I was in Baghdad.
Not that 2003.
Oh, yeah, exactly. When I was in Baghdad in 2003, I went to the Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon. I think I may have said to you before, but if we were having this conversation in Babylon, we would have thought Nebuchadnezzar's empire would last forever. Well, it didn't. Neither did the Greeks or the Romans or anybody else. Communism was going to be the end of history. The Third Reich was going to last 1,000 years. There is no God-given right for our Western civilizations, we understand it, to survive. And there are lots of indicators that is changing, and it's changing far faster than most people, I think, realize. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. It will take, a number of years, and these civilizations in the past didn't crash and burn overnight, but they crashed and burned.
How do you, though, in a society which lives on the 1 minute flick through news on TikTok, to have these sorts of conversations? Because if you only take a brief look at things, you don't see the change. Whereas if you study it and look about where were we 30 years ago, where will we stay, where are we going to be, what are the trends? There are some alarming trends out there.
Yeah.
How do we create an environment where people at least aware or study or...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, sounds a bit arrogant probably, but of course, a large chunk of the people out there aren't going to engage in these conversations. I mean, that's just the reality. We have got Policy Exchange, Institute of Government, Theos. We've got lots of think tanks out there that are doing, serious analysis of this stuff. I'm not convinced, from my personal point of view, that they're naturally coming at it from the same direction as I would, or seeing the same picture. But I think people they're looking at the impact of demography. They're looking at the impact of climate change. They're looking at the nature of the world around us and so on. And I think, perhaps they will begin to put on the table some of the issues we're talking about.
But at the moment, it seems to be locked in a very academic sphere.
I agree with you.
With a bunch of old folks that, hair out their nostrils and pontificate.
Trusty old generals.
Rather than...
Air marshals.
Well, exactly. Rather than actually the people who need to be aware of the environment around them. And
but as we know, the majority, I would say probably the vast majority of people under the age of about 30 get their news from TikTok. And how you draw them from sweeping through a couple of minutes comment into being prepared to spend 3 or 4 minutes looking at a bit more deeply, and then to look at something that actually means they're going to have to sit down for an hour and read something and think about it and say, okay, what does this mean for me, and so on. It is increasingly difficult, and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, the social or the anti-social media, as I find myself calling it nowadays, is not helpful in this. But I'm not one of despair and despondency. Like a lot of these issues, first of all, we need to recognise the issue and begin to get our minds around the problem, and then begin to think about, okay, so what do we do about it? And I do actually think this is about winning a battle of ideals. battle of ideas. And our ideas are powerful ideas. Freedom, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. Why do we think thousands of people, tens of thousands of people want to come and live in the UK and not stay in half these countries around the world? Because they want to be with us. Sorry.
No, Tim, I think you're spot on. The thing is, our politicians, apart from some of the politicians that sit on the edge, our politicians are not talking about this. They're not raising these issues with us, the public, who put them in power at all.
No.
So that worries me. And, you talk about the protection of our culture and our values, the sort of stuff Sean mentioned as well, then that's if you recognize that too late, you're in a pretty perilous state, because the momentum has been gathered, whilst you've been looking somewhere else.
Yeah, you do reach, I think you do reach a tipping point, and to regain from that is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And I don't want to get, overly political about it. I think, we had a change in government, and for an awful lot of people, if not the majority, I know only 20% of the people who could vote actually voted for the current government. And of those who did vote, only about a third did. But nonetheless, there was a general underlying feeling that we needed a change here. But how did the Labour Party fight that campaign? Mostly by just staying quiet and not putting any of the issues on these. Because the minute you start debating this, you inevitably cause division and people disagreements and all that sort of stuff. And we do live in a world, sadly, where there aren't many conversations going on. There are lots of pretty nasty brickbat throwing and accusing everybody. If you don't agree with me, then I'm going to put you up against the wall and shoot you. So we do need to somehow encourage conversation, and the government, with a lot of economic issues that they need to sort out, and all the big issues that we know about, the NHS and so on and so forth, which I don't think are going to be solved that quickly. But nonetheless, we do need to try and encourage this conversation through things like this and get people to engage.
Well, I rather, jokingly called you an armchair general yesterday.
Yeah.
But I think people like you two, who have got enough nous and long-term historical understanding of some of these big issues, which ultimately make a huge difference in the way the world is either united or fragmented. Somehow people like you two ought to find yourself a bigger voice, because some of the things you've just described, we need to be talking about. And, people like me need to be coaxed to listen to the conversations. Now, we're not, because our thumb moves, 10 times a minute. So, yeah, I am actually quite worried about what the next 50 years looks like. And if our politicians aren't doing it, which they're not, the previous government didn't do it at all. They said a few things, but nothing actually happened. I do not see the current government doing it at all. They'd sooner hide from this sort of subject. So it's left to fringe politicians who really have no voice and no power. So who else is it left? Well, people like you somehow need to be speaking up and listened to.
Well, in a way, it's almost like the institutional failing of our democratic system, though, isn't it? One of the benefits of an autocratic system is that she stays in power for 20, 30 years and therefore can think strategically. Whereas in our institutionally short-term politicians, they promise the world, then they get into power and go, oh dear. And then with a couple of years to go, they go, we've got to prepare now for the next election.
A classic example of that.
Exactly.
Within 2 years of a presidential election, they're back into, presidential.
So nobody, even big things like the NHS, which I haven't met a politician from whatever walk of life who believes this is a sustainable model.
No.
But none of them are prepared to go in front of the electorate and say, we need to find a new way of doing this.
Yeah,
so we'll throw a bit more money at it and it'll be the next person's problem.
Well, I think that, there's, again, 2 or 3 issues there. I happen to have met Wes Streeting a couple of times, and I was quite impressed with him, actually. He's a really nice bloke. But he certainly doesn't believe the current model is sustainable for much longer. But we do live in a world where for most people, the answer to every problem is you either pass a law about it or you chuck money at it. And that's not unimportant. Parliament and political perspective and the city, the economic perspective, they're both very important. I took my granddaughter to London about 2 weeks ago, 14, Eloise, lives in Glasgow. And we went to the theatre and we went around various places and we were walking back across Westminster Bridge And I stopped halfway across, and I pointed to Westminster Abbey and St Paul's. Well, I pointed to Parliament, talked about Parliament. I pointed to Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral and said, "What are those places for?" Without hesitation, Eloise, 14, frankly, hardly ever set foot in a church or anything like that, not interested in that stuff, immediately said, "They're places of hope." And I thought that was brilliant.
Wow.
And Parliament and the city are not places of hope. And in the context of what we're talking about here, there's something about a younger generation that's looking around them saying, I need something additional to this. Why have we got huge issues of mental health problems and all of that stuff? So part of the answer is communicating to that generation. Now, they are a generation that communicates by TikTok. I don't use social media much at all. But I'm challenged by it to saying, and I'm in a way picking up your point, people like us have got to engage in that medium because that's how we should communicate and that's how we will influence that generation. And, they are not a generation that we should be writing off. I mean, these are good people and, they need hope. They need inspiration. They need leadership. They need to believe in something. And they've lost faith in organizations and structures, including the church, including Parliament, including the city, including education and all sorts of other stuff. For various reasons, some of which are...
But I think what's lovely, because we're probably going to regret going down this rabbit hole, but actually I love it because it actually does all come back from Ukraine as a symptom rather than disease.
Yeah.
If you actually extrapolate that to what we were talking about outside, which is the danger of society today is we put sticky plasters over things. We don't actually solve the problems. I was struck, we were talking a little bit outside about how... I'm an agnostic, but I believe we live in a Christian society. The Christian values that are part of the foundations of what makes our country great. But actually, because they sort of get linked to the church, and the danger is that's in decline, we sort of be moving away from those. And when you look at our MPs that are the centre of our democracy, now, I can't remember the number, but 70 odd that are now Muslims.
Yeah.
Not that I'm against, but it just shows the rise of a different value set. And that's linked to people coming across from the continent and being able to stay here. It comes to areas of our country now that are non-English speaking. And all of this, if you draw the graphs, you say, well, it's 70 today. When does it become a majority? And when it becomes a majority, we live in a democracy. Therefore, the values now of the Islamic faith can now be imposed on our country.
Yep.
And I'm not being melodramatic about this. This is I was in the military. I spent 30 years fighting, for the values, prepared to put my life on the line like you did for our country. But our country's foundation, they are changing.
Yes,
You've got to wake up to the fact that they are.
They are. And we were, I was in Kosovo building refugee camps for Kosovar Albanians who are Muslims. I mean, this is not against anybody. It's about a conversation which says, what's the culture of Western civilization in the round going to look like in 20 or 30 years' time? I mean, the great expression that I came across some time ago is that we are increasingly living in a cut flower society. Now, what do I mean by that? If we were sitting outside in my garden yesterday and I was there this morning with my son, and the garden's looking quite nice at the moment, and there's lots of flowers, blooming.
And your wife's done a very good job. I saw it all happening.
Yes, that's quite. Well, if and when we cut those flowers from the garden and put them in a vase and stick them on the dining room table because we're going to have people around for lunch or something, those cut flowers will look fine for a while. But the true reality, the harsh reality, is that they will end up in the brown bin in about 2 weeks' time. If you cut flowers off away from the foundation from which the roots were deeply rooted and grew and so on, those cut flowers do not throw fresh seeds into the soil and they do not bring new life. And so, we can have a broader conversation, but that what we live in today is the result of generations of people embedded in the soil that's changed and developed over time. And a Judeo-Christian heritage. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And it wasn't perfect by any manner of means, but nonetheless, that's where it's all come from. The danger is if you cut yourself off from that, then those values are no longer what are they going to be rooted in? And there's, picking up the different, again, the clash of civilizations, the different civilizations, they have different values, they have different roots. And I don't think there's any doubt at all that we will have an Islamic party in the UK in the years to come. And why shouldn't we? I mean, many of our people have come from that world, but that will look different. It will look different. And as you look at the demography and the changes that are going to be happening over the next 20 or 30 years. So I don't have an easy answer to this, but I think the conversation needs to happen so that we begin to pan out and plan out, okay, so what does that mean for us? What does that look like? What are these changes going to be? And, the bottom line is, when I look around the world at other civilizations, I don't actually fancy living there. I don't want to live in Russia or any other, China and what they're doing in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs and so forth. I want the UK to be what it's been for the last, quite a long time of its history, a pretty good place to be.
That's an interesting conversation as to how much we should be looking outwards and how much we should be looking inwards.
Yeah.
And the danger, I think, is that every now and again we have to have a good, harsh look in the mirror. And
so that's my point about what are we defending? What are we trying to
well, you've articulated it quite well. But somebody has to get the debate into the politics, and it's not there. Well, for a number of reasons, they won't have the conversation. So it seems like it's left to, people like us, whose voice is, quite low in the scheme of things. I mean, interestingly enough, I was just thinking when Tim was speaking, Sean, TikTok is our biggest success. Probably 2 million views by now. We should take it really seriously. I mean, the big moment for me came that the world's biggest atheist is Richard Dawkins, who's been very successful at persuading people that there isn't a God. Just a couple of weeks ago, he said 2 quite interesting things. Firstly, he says he really doesn't want the UK to lose its Christianity. And secondly, he said, and come to think of it, I'm a cultural Christian.
Cultural Christian. He calls himself a cultural Christian.
Because of the things you said, Sean, the values.
Yeah.
Now, he has been vehement. I mean, he has been full headlong, like Saul was in the New Testament.
Yeah.
He sounded like he wanted to rid everything of Christianity completely. Now he's slightly worried that, what he was trying to do might actually come true.
Yeah. And you have to ask, okay, what would replace it?
But something else would, definitely.
Yeah. So, and something will fill the void. No doubt about that at all. Now, I should say, there's a lot about today's world that's a hell of a lot better than when I was growing up in the 1950s. And some of the social changes, my own daughter is now divorced, and I don't think any woman should be tied into a marriage where she is badly treated or, not happy and so on and so forth. My son is married to another bloke, James, who's a great guy. I mean, then they're very powerful, very strong, and they're just about to go off on holiday together. So some of these changes have been very positive changes. I don't like the word progressive in one sense, because it rather says that if you don't like some of these proposed changes, you're a sort of, you're Neanderthal, whatever. But some of these changes in our world today, Western civilization world, we have led the way in some of these changes, and they are affecting the way the rest of the world sees some of this stuff. And the big debates within Church of England, for example, on what they call living in love and faith, it's making people think about this stuff. So I don't want to be, as I said earlier, I'm not in despair or despondent. I think we can push back on some of this stuff. We can win the arguments, but we do have to engage, and we have to win the battle of ideas. What does that mean for us individually and collectively?
And I think it goes back to 30 years of peace dividend. We've largely wars of choice. We've been sat in a little tower, decided where we want to engage and where we don't. It's a different world out there now, and I think there's some fundamental questions that need to be asked.
And there are repercussions to that. I mean, again, we were chatting earlier, but what's going on in Sudan today is absolutely awful, and yet we, the West, collectively, we're not interested.
We traditionally, though, haven't. We've largely operated with our own national interest at heart. I mean, I think that historically, Africa has suffered huge difficulties, droughts and whatever. We've largely turned a Nelsonian eye to sometimes. The charity arms do, but strategically we don't. Ukraine is the interesting one because it's not a member of NATO, but I would argue it's because it's on Europe's doorstep.
Yeah, sure.
And we've suddenly gone, actually, we had 2 world wars that started in a similar fashion. We can't let this thing fester.
Yes, and notwithstanding my earlier comment, nonetheless, if Russia were to win, had won easily, they will emerge from it either victorious and feeling pretty happy with themselves, or having not done well and have to relearn and so forth. They won't go away. They will emerge from the summit.
I think they'll do both. I think they'll be selling it as a victory, whatever happens.
Yeah, sure.
But they'll be licking their wounds and going, this didn't quite play out the way we thought it would.
And the impact on, the Baltic states and the others, Moldova and Belarus and other people in the area, it's going to be long lasting.
Yeah.
These things have an impact.
So you mentioned Belarus, not talked about much. I mean, it's sort of in the news a little bit. but nobody's quite sure whether it's important or not. It's got a big relationship with Russia.
Yep.
It's got what some people might consider to be a dictator who won the election through corruption.
Last European dictator he's known as.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah.
There you go.
Lukashenko is known as the last European dictator.
Amazing. And I think there's been riots and protests, maybe not to much avail, but big dependency relationship with Russia. Do you think it's a factor? Is anything going on there that you think is worthy of noting while we're still talking about Russia?
Yeah, well, in one sense, it's been interesting because when the war started, I thought, and the Russians did use Belarus as an axis, and you could argue that it's been surprising they haven't made more use of Belarus in that sense. It's a pretty small country. It's got a population of about 9 million. It's quite small in geographical area. And of course, it came out of the USSR. It was very closely linked to Russia. And it's got this union state status with Russia now. So when Putin talks about Ukraine and what Russia should be, he sweeps up Belarus, Ukraine, and a couple of others in the context of that's what Russia really is. So he sees Belarus as part of Russia. There have been people on the streets complaining, but I think it's a pretty solid relationship. I mean, something like 2/3 of Belarus's trade is with Russia, and the politics is very closely aligned and so forth. So I can't see them in any sense breaking away. But it is still an independent country, and he has not been universally supportive of Russia in the context of Ukraine. Actually, speaking publicly and the UN and other places, he hasn't condemned it outright by any manner of means, but he hasn't been.
But he's had an interesting line stroke because I think economically, you touched on it there. My understanding is that Russia provides heavily subsidized energy to Belarus. So in other words, bribery by means of, and Lukashenko, at the time then when Russia forward deployed troops, there was a lot of talk about Belarusian troops getting involved. And my understanding was nearly a mutiny because the Belarusian military said, this is not our fight. Yeah. If it was to be a free vote tomorrow, Lukashenko would not be in power. So he is in power. He's managed to keep himself in power, but he's also got to be quite careful how he navigates that. So in principle, he's very supportive. There was talk about troops massing on the Belarusian border, and you went, that might or might not be true, but I don't think there's any danger of any Belarusians coming across the border because that would probably mark the end of Lukashenko.
That people are, ask the question, what happens when he goes? Because he won't be around forever. Rather than the question, what happens when Putin goes? But the Russians did put, I think, something like 9,000 Russian soldiers into Belarus.
Well, they put forward deployed nuclear weapons in there.
And I was just going to say, and they put nuclear weapons there. Yeah. So, it's a pretty strong relationship. I don't see it changing much in the near future. And there's talk of this gas pipeline too that Russia want to put through. And so, I just think it's a very and this union state, which they're encouraging other people to join. I can't see many people lining up to join it, but nonetheless, it's a pretty strong relationship. It's the bottom line.
Pavel Durov is the founder of Telegram.
Yeah.
Sort of a renegade messaging app. He has got a French passport, but he made the mistake of landing in France, got arrested. There's a lot of chatter that the actual charges they got him on are pretty flimsy. However, what they might be trying to do is strong-arm him into opening the application, let's say the back door, so that the West gets visibility of what's happening with its enemies, Russians and all sorts of other people who would use Telegram as one of their communication vehicles because they know it's, in quotes, safe. Are you hearing anything? I mean, if you're not, what do you think? I mean, I believe anything of anybody in politics, as you know. So have you got an opinion?
Well, I do have an opinion, actually. I'm surprised he'd been arrested, but that's part of a broader issue, which is about how these platforms are used. But it is no different. I mean, when we WhatsApp one another, basically it's pretty secure. Now, no system is secure. And there's been a lot of evidence in terms of police work that has managed to get inside systems that the criminal world thought was secure. So no system is secure. In that sense, Telegram is no different to WhatsApp or to a number of other platforms. The broader question is, does the platform owner, can he or she be held accountable for what appears on the platform? And if you feel that is so, how do you possibly police that? There is this, build-up in Europe, which is beginning to say this has to change. Now, we could talk about, we touched on social media earlier, but if you have a sort of spectrum of has the internet oblique social media oblique these platforms and things, on balance, have they been good for society or bad for society? I have to say, on balance, I would come out with they're not good for us. There's been lots of good stuff that's flowed from it. I can email my brother-in-law in Australia. I can speak to my mates, all over the world and so forth. But 90% probably of the dark web, these platforms and so forth, are used badly. I mean, they're used for criminality. And whereas the police used to be able to follow quite a lot of what was going on in terms of child sexual exploitation, in terms of, asylum seeking and all that stuff, these platforms are closing the ability for law enforcement in these areas. And therefore, I come from a perspective that I'd much rather be able to live in where we can access this stuff, and we can break up these, as partly because my son works for the National Crime Agency, but they are dealing with some pretty nasty, well, not pretty, they've been very brutal, nasty people. We're dealing with that all over the world. So picking this guy up is only a part of a wider conversation, I think, which is about what is the future of these platforms? Can they be held to account? Should they be held to account? And if so, how do you do that? And I just think that we need to understand, we collectively need to understand that this is, he's not the only one. These platforms are doing this all over the place.
It's a problem, isn't it? Because if you're not careful, you end up in an issue of free speech.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you give governments free access, other agencies, which is what will happen, access to these, then what you're doing, you're actually encroaching on the life of a citizen like me. And I'm not sure I'm happy with that, because, words can be turned. A collection of words that you're casually communicating with somebody actually deliberately can be taken by politicians and turned against you. If you're their friend, they'll deal with you lightly. And we're seeing some of this at the moment. If you're not their friend, they will deal with you harshly. So I think it's a bit of a slippery slope. Now, I can't argue with you that if I sell you a pen and you write nasty stuff with that pen, I wish I hadn't sold you the pen. But should that stop me having the right to provide a communication vehicle? I'm not sure.
No.
I think it's very difficult.
It is. No, it is difficult. And I think you're right. I mean, free speech, we will all feel pretty strongly about that. And there is an argument that we are losing that free speech in a number of areas, slowly, being pushed back. And you look at somewhere like China, of course, where the whole of this area of surveillance and so on, where people are being given credits, are not allowed to go to places, and all of that. That's the world that we're beginning to live in. So I'm not saying that we should do away with the ability to have secure communications in the round, but I do think that at the right level within government and the law enforcement world, however one sees that, there should be an ability and there should be an understanding that if I go to this organisation and say I need to see this stuff because we deeply, we're concerned about child sexual exploitation, whatever it is, there should be a way of getting into that. Of course, when you open that door, who knows where it goes? But on balance, that's where I sit at the moment anyway.
So we've talked a lot about the conflict in Ukraine, but of course also at the moment the Gaza-Israel conflict continues. I think it's been really interesting development over the last few days. Obviously, Tel Aviv, loads of protesters saying, more needs to be done to get the hostages out. And I think I'd just like to get your take on this, because right at the start of the war, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, I've got two objectives, to eliminate Hamas. There was a bit of interpretation that really it sounded like it meant degrade their ability to run the country and fight again. And the other one was to free the hostages. It was pretty clear where his priority lay. Yeah. And the hostages.
And it wasn't the hostages.
It wasn't the hostages.
Yeah.
But if you look at now, the fighting is largely, it's not over, but it's abated significantly. And therefore, there's legitimate questions about what's going to happen about the hostages, particularly in light of this past weekend when 6 were tragically killed. Sounds like they were murdered by Hamas as a direct result of an IDF operation to go and find them. And that's led to a lot of accusations that Hamas has said, if you continue these operations, we'll continue killing hostages. If you step back from it, what is the most effective way of getting those hostages out? Is it political or military? Back in November, ceasefire, politically negotiated, over 100 hostages released. In the whole course of the war, only 8 hostages have been released by military action, one most recently a week ago, I think on Tuesday. with 97 hostages left, 35 of those expected to be dead. So it's around just over 60 alive. Given that the war seems to be largely over, the only way that those are going to be able to see freedom again, that their families are going to see them again, is through some form of negotiation. And yet, it still feels that Netanyahu is stubbornly ignoring the need to do that. What's your take at all of this?
I think there's a number of issues that flow through this conversation. Firstly, Netanyahu, like any politician, is in power alongside others, politicians, and his political power rests on the support of some pretty extremist views in Israel, whether one agrees with them or not. You know, there are a relatively small number of people on one end of the spectrum here. So I don't think, for me, there's no doubt at all, this is, I would say, certainly a part of, if you could argue, a pretty large part of Netanyahu's determination, desire to stay in power.
But I believe you're right. But if I put that in different words, in effect,
his personal ambition is above the hostages and everything else. No, I agree. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying that's where I think he sits. I think in the context of the hostages in the round, and I know you would accept that, but I think in the way the media as a whole presents some of this, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact this is not about two state organizations fighting a war, in inverted commas, as equal players, where they are obeying the laws of armed conflict, the rules of engagement, the Geneva Conventions, they're fighting in uniform, they're fighting on a battlefield, they're fighting, conventional wars as you and I understand it. This is about a bunch of thugs who are prepared to go into Israel, massacre a lot of people, take a lot of hostages, and are quite prepared to kill them day by day if people don't give in to their desires. And my natural instinct is to say, there's absolutely no way I'm going to negotiate with these people. I mean, Margaret Thatcher famously said, we just do not negotiate with terrorists.
But Netanyahu did in November. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either do it or you don't.
Yeah.
He did it.
Yeah.
100 were released.
But that's part of the debate. Now, once you've opened up those negotiations and you end up with and a recognition that, notwithstanding what I've just said, Hamas is a powerful organization, not as powerful as Hezbollah, but it's powerful in Gaza. It has a lot of support. We shouldn't forget this. Hamas was elected by the people of Gaza, even though their stated intent was to wipe out Israel. And there's all sorts of reasons why that wouldn't have happened. But, they've got no option but to recognize the reality of the situation on the ground. And that this is going to have to come to an end at some point. And therefore, there's going to have, rather like Ukraine, there's going to have to be a negotiated ceasefire end to this, whatever it looks like. And how much that will mean in terms of the IDF staying in Gaza and so on and so forth. But so laying out that background, notwithstanding, the military, as we've just said before, what is the role of the military? To secure the ground, to enable within that context for politics and so forth to sort out the root of the problem. I mean, it's a pretty deeply rooted problem, but they're not going to achieve that much more. I think if I was a senior military commander in Israel, I'd be saying to Netanyahu, we can't do much more. We've destroyed and degraded Hamas capability a lot. We've secured a lot of the territory. We've destroyed a lot of the tunnels. We've et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We could be there for another 6 months if you want us to be there. We could be there for another 2 years, but we're not going to change the dynamic much. We are reaching the top of the plateau here. Therefore, if you want to get the rest of these hostages out, you're going to have to be prepared to sit around the table and somehow get them out. Now, what do Hamas want out of this? From my perspective, the longer this goes on and the longer that Hamas are able to ensure that Israel does nasty things to Gaza and Netanyahu says the things that he says and so on and so forth, Hamas love it. They don't care about the civilians. They don't care about people in Gaza. They are trying to undermine the state of Israel and destroy the Jewish state. They are anti-Semitic, in the broadest sense. So that the longer things got on, they would argue, if you and I were sitting here as Hamas players, we'd be saying, actually, this has gone really well. We're winning world opinion here. We're succeeding in what we're trying to achieve. So,
well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I sometimes get accused of being pro-Palestinian, but it's more just trying to hold up the other side.
Being pro-Palestinian is not the same as being pro-Hamas.
No. But
I mean, I'm pro-Palestinian, but I'm not pro-Hamas.
No. But you raised the prospect that, and quite rightly, admittedly, it's over 20 years ago, but they were voted in. So Palestinians, if you vote in your government, you can't then say it's the government's fault. You still have to live with the consequences. I mean,
you're being accused of being pro-Palestinian. I mean,
because I think that there is in a way, we've talked about in the West Bank, things are gradually being cleared out. In the Gaza, unemployment running at 50%. I'm not remotely justifying what happened on that day. But in a way, if you are a Palestinian, the Palestinian question hasn't yet been answered.
No, sure.
And most of the Western world thought that a two-state solution might be the answer. I guess my point is we're not going to solve that here, but it just feels like the plight of the hostages now, which is heartbreaking for family. As a parent,
Yeah.
you know, to see video and to, you know your loved ones are there and know that on one side, all parties are ready to negotiate, but actually it's probably your own government that's stopping that happening. The principle of not wanting to negotiate with terrorists, I absolutely get that. But there's a realpolitik about this, isn't there? If that is the only way. And I guess my question relates to more that over 80 years, it's been proved that Israel and Hamas, Israel and the Palestinians will never come to an agreement. There's visceral hatred now. So surely what actually needs to be put in place is to have a body above them. You know, the US president, I think it was Bill Clinton at the time, tried famously to persuade Yasser Arafat, but the pictures were all a US president, nobody else, who was trying to pretend to be non-partisan, but clearly supporting Israel. It feels like you need Saudi Arabia and the US.
Well, you see, that's the important point, because you know, in a sense, what you're saying is, I know you're not saying this, but let's go back to the British Mandate, where we sat above all of this and in theory tried to control it.
Yeah.
Of course, it didn't happen. It's going to have to come from within the Arab world, I think.
Yes.
But so some sort of bigger ability to look at this more strategically and gather what's going on. Just to go back to one point, of course, Israel, again, historically, whenever hostages have been taken, Israel has got those hostages out from militarily, basically. You know, be it the Munich Olympics, so on and so forth, be it the business in Uganda under Amin and so forth. They have used force to release their hostages, and generally speaking, they've been pretty successful in it. And so culturally and emotionally, in a way, I can understand why people are very reluctant to do anything other than get these people out by force.
Well, it sends a clear message as well, doesn't it? We're not going to negotiate.
Exactly.
Do this.
Exactly.
As soon as you have negotiated, though.
I know, and you made that point, and it's a very valid point. But there's a danger that at the end of all of this, the message that sits on the table, not just for Hamas, but for a lot of other people, is you want to solve your problem? Go and slaughter a few people, take a few hostages, and then just sit and wait. And that's not a message that I think is very helpful. Now, in terms of the mandate, I've always felt the two-state solution would be very difficult. And we're not just talking about the people in Gaza. As we said earlier, we're talking about millions of people living in refugee camps in places like Jordan, generations of people. And bringing that together and finding a solution for it, I despair, really. And I just can't see what the answer is. A single-state solution in terms of the demographics, Israel is not going to go along with, because in a democratic state like that, they would never, the Jewish people would never be in power. It'd be a minority player. So there's no short answer to it. So the overall political situation, I just find, not in despair over, but I find very difficult to see a solution. But picking up your main point, how to get the rest of these hostages out, the reality of where we stand today in the context of both the military fight and the politics and the ceasefire business, I think, you're going to have to sit around a table and negotiate them out.
So if they're sat around a table, and there might be others involved, but you've got Hamas on one side, Israel on the other, what are Israel giving Hamas for Hamas to let loose the hostages?
Well, it would range from give us back Gaza, get out of Gaza, take all your military out of it, give us back the authority to run the place ourselves, and and also help us rebuild the place. I mean, amongst a number of other things, but those are the first things that come to my mind. And one of the conversations is inevitably how does Israel, what is the military presence in Gaza? Does it continue? How do you secure that environment without having a military presence on the ground? Otherwise, Hamas would just start redigging all the tunnels and rebuilding their arms and getting weapons and rockets and all the rest of it back in. And in 5 years' time, we'll be back at it again in the same way that Lebanon has.
That's one of the reasons why this Philadelphia corridor has been caught the news, because that's corridor between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. Because it's either water or Israel around the rest of the border, and most of the arms, it appears, come across that border, and therefore the Israelis have said, for exact reasons, you can't do that. I think previous negotiations have involved a lot of release of Palestinian prisoners that held in Israel, potentially the survival of Yahya Sinwar, providing him with safe sanctuary out of the country, potentially, how do you get military out of Gaza, but how do you, and there's another 2 corridors being built, aren't there, that seem to be like a colonial way of splitting up the country. It makes it easier for the military to quickly get in, and also means it's a lot more difficult for Hamas to move freely around. But
picking up your point about other negotiations, can't remember when, but there was one point where Israel gave up well over 1,000 Palestinians in order to secure the release of one IDF soldier.
Yes, we'll put a picture of him up.
But anyway, my point I was going to make was one of those Palestinians who was released as part of that deal
was, Yahya Sinwar. Yeah.
And if you're an Israeli, where's the sense in that? I don't know. There's no, as we've said, it's no easy answer to this.
Yeah,
but the key issue of the hostages, I think there's been something played along the type we've discussed in the run-up to this, but where we are today, whether any of them will still be alive.
And that it's just purely from a humanitarian perspective. I think as a former military guy like myself, it feels like the day of the military action is fast coming to a close. It's therefore the role of the political masters now to achieve their part in this, which is to deliver the end state. And the plight of the hostages now lies firmly, it seems to me, in the hands of the politicians rather than the military. And yet, potentially, for more parochial reasons, those negotiations appear to be struggling.
Yeah.
And I know there's some horrible compromises that need to be done, but ultimately, feels like we're fast approaching that time.
Yeah.